The morning sun cast long shadows across Cumbri village as the first military convoy appeared on the horizon. Dust clouds billowed behind the vehicles, creating a haze that seemed to dance between the acacia trees lining the narrow dirt road. For most villagers, the sight of soldiers meant only one thing: trouble was coming. Fatu Wedraugo, a mother of 3, stood in her doorway clutching her youngest child against her chest. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she remembered the last time soldiers had come to Cumbri. 2 years ago, during the insurgency, mortar fire had torn through the hills surrounding their peaceful community. The memory of that terrifying night, the screams, the burning huts, the desperate flight into the darkness, was etched forever in the minds of everyone who had survived. "Mama, why are the soldiers here?" asked her 8-year-old son, Musa, tugging at her colorful wrapper. Fatu looked down at her boy's innocent face, those wide eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. How could she explain that in their country soldiers sometimes came to protect and sometimes came to destroy? How could she tell him that in Burkina Faso, the line between friend and enemy had become dangerously thin? "I don't know, my child," she whispered, pulling him closer. "But today feels different, and it was different." As the convoy drew nearer, Fatu could see something unusual: flags fluttering from the vehicles. Not the stark military banners she remembered, but colorful cloths that caught the morning breeze like celebrations. The sound that reached them wasn't the harsh rumble of war machines, but the rhythmic beating of drums growing stronger with each passing minute. Elder Burema, the village chief who had guided Cumbri through decades of hardship and hope, emerged from his compound wearing his finest bubu. His face, normally creased with the weight of constant worry, showed something Fatu hadn't seen in years: genuine excitement. "Today is not a day for fear," he announced to the gathering villagers. "Today, our president comes not as a soldier, but as a son of Burkina Faso. Today, Ibrahim Traoré brings us promises, not problems." The announcement rippled through the crowd like electricity. President Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who had taken power promising to restore dignity to their nation, was actually coming to their small, forgotten village. Women began ululating, their voices rising in traditional celebration. Children ran between the gathering adults, their laughter mixing with the approaching drums. Awa Traoré, no relation to the president, despite sharing his surname, had spent the entire previous night preparing. As the village's most respected weaver, she had been chosen to present the president with a traditional cloth, one that told the story of Cumbri's resilience through its intricate patterns. Each thread represented a family that had stayed, each color a season of hardship they had endured together. "This cloth carries our history," she had told her daughter while working by lamplight. "When the president touches it, he touches every hand that refused to let this village die." Now, as the convoy finally arrived, Awa stood with the other women who had lined the narrow lanes with baskets of millet, mangoes, and groundnuts, offerings from their modest harvests to show respect for their leader. The first vehicle that stopped wasn't an armored car or a tank, but a simple pickup truck covered in dust from the long journey. When the door opened, out stepped a man who looked nothing like the distant political figures the villagers had seen on television or heard about on radio. Ibrahim Traoré was young, barely in his 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life that had known real work. He wasn't surrounded by the usual wall of bodyguards and protocol officers. Instead, he moved through the crowd with an ease that surprised everyone, kneeling beside elders to receive their blessings, lifting children for photographs that would later become treasured family heirlooms, and listening, truly listening, more than he spoke. "Mr. President," called out Mamadou Sawadogo, a farmer whose fields had been destroyed in the insurgency, "will you really bring us water?" Traoré stopped in his tracks and walked directly to the old farmer. He took the man's hands, rough and cracked from years of working dry soil, in his own. "Not just water, Papa," he said, using the respectful term for elder. "We will bring an irrigation system built by our own people, funded by money that belongs to Burkina Faso and protected by communities like this one. No more begging, No more waiting for others to save us, the crowd murmured approval. For too long, they had watched foreign NGOs make promises, take photographs, and disappear. For too long, their government had seemed like something that happened to other people. In distant cities, behind closed doors, a small platform had been constructed under a grove of banana trees, their broad leaves providing natural shade from the intensifying sun. When Traoré finally stepped up to address the gathering, he didn't begin with the usual political rhetoric or grand declarations. Instead, he told a story. "I was once a boy like many of you," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I herded goats in the north, watched my mother's weathered hands work miracles with nothing, and knew what it meant to watch a well run dry." An old woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. A young man nodded knowingly. Children who had been fidgeting grew still, captivated by the sight of their president sharing something real and personal. "That boy learned that hope is not something you wait for," Traoré continued. "It's something you build, with your own hands alongside your neighbors, for your children who deserve better than what we inherited." Near the back of the crowd, just beyond the circle of celebration, stood a figure that didn't quite belong. He was small, no more than 12 years old, wearing a faded yellow shirt that had seen too many washings and jeans that were several sizes too short for his thin frame. His sandals were clearly hand-me-downs, far too big for his feet, making small clouds of dust with each nervous step. His name was Umar, though few people knew it. For the past 3 days, he had been sleeping in an abandoned hut on the outskirts of Cumbri, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers who assumed he was just another displaced child, a common sight in a country still recovering from years of instability. But Umar wasn't lost. He was exactly where he had been told to be, carrying exactly what he had been instructed to carry. In one hand, he clutched a plastic water bottle, cracked and refilled so many times that the label had worn away completely. Under his shirt, pressed against his thin chest, was something else entirely, something that made his heart race with a mixture of terror and grim. Determination. The knife had been given to him 2 days earlier by a man he knew only as Uncle, though they shared no blood. It was military grade, its blade long and sharp enough to slide between ribs and find a human heart with deadly efficiency. The man had shown him exactly how to hold it, where to strike, how to approach without arousing suspicion. "You are small," the man had said, his voice soft, but somehow more frightening than any shout. "People see children and think innocent. They see orphans and think helpless. That is your weapon, their assumptions." Umar had been trained for weeks at a compound he wasn't supposed to describe, alongside other children whose names he wasn't supposed to remember. They had been taught to move silently, to smile when scared, to disappear into crowds like ghosts. Most importantly, they had been taught that their lives didn't matter, only their mission mattered. "You will be remembered if you are invisible," the instructors had repeated during endless drills. It was a paradox designed to confuse young minds, to replace normal childhood logic with something darker and more malleable. Now, watching President Traoré speak about hope and building the future, Umar felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. The man on the platform didn't look like the monster he had been told about. He didn't sound like someone who deserved to die. But the man who had dropped him off in the white van had been very clear about what would happen if Umar failed to complete his mission. "If you don't do this," the man had said, "others will suffer. Other boys like you will be sent. But they might not be as careful. Innocent people might get hurt. Do you want that on your conscience?" Umar's hands shook as he watched Traoré step down from the platform, moving into the crowd to greet individual villagers. The president was heading in his direction, following a path that would bring him within arm's reach in just a few minutes. The boy's training kicked in automatically. He began moving through the crowd, using his small size to slip between adults who were focused on catching a glimpse of their leader. His right hand moved instinctively to his chest, feeling the outline of the weapon beneath his shirt. But as he got closer, something unexpected happened. Traoré's eyes found his. It wasn't a casual glance or the kind of politician's smile designed to work a crowd. The president was looking directly at him, and in that gaze, Umar saw something that made his carefully constructed resolve begin to crumble. He saw recognition, not of who Umar was, but of what he was carrying. Traoré had spent years in military service before entering politics. He had served in regions where child soldiers were a devastating reality, where boys even younger than Umar had been turned into weapons by adults who understood that innocence could be weaponized more effectively than any gun or bomb. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew how to look. The boy's posture was wrong, too rigid for a child at a celebration, too focused for someone simply trying to see the president. His eyes weren't following the dancers or the music. They were tracking Traoré's movements with the kind of precision that comes from training, not curiosity. Most telling of all, the boy was trembling, not with excitement like the other children, but with the specific kind of fear that comes from knowing you're about to cross a line from which there is no return. When Traoré saw the knife, just a glimpse of metal beneath the boy's shirt, his security training screamed at him to act. Call for his guards, create distance, neutralize the threat according to standard protocol. Any reasonable person would have done exactly that. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré did something that would be called madness by some and genius by others. He kept walking forward. The boy froze as the president approached, his young mind struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't part of the plan. The target was supposed to remain oblivious until it was too late. But Traoré was looking right at him, seeing right through him, and still approaching without fear or anger. When the president was close enough to reach out and touch him, Traoré did something even more unexpected. He knelt down, at eye level with the trembling child. The president opened his arms in a gesture of embrace and spoke words that would haunt Umar for the rest of his life. "You don't have to do this." 5 simple words that shattered everything the boy had been taught about strength, about power, about what it meant to be a man in a world that had shown him only cruelty. Umar's knees buckled. He collapsed into the dusty ground, great heaving sobs racking his small frame. The knife remained in his hand, but his fingers had gone weak. He couldn't have lifted it if he wanted to. The crowd around them had gone silent, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Traoré's security detail began moving forward, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons, but their leader held up a hand to stop them. "No harm," he said firmly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "He is not our enemy." Through his tears, Umar began to speak, first in broken whispers, then in a flood of words that poured out like water from a broken dam. He told them about the white van, about the man with the ring, about the compound where children learned to kill. He described faces without names, routines without reasons, and drills disguised as games. He explained how he had been chosen specifically because he was small, forgettable, and desperate. How they had told him his parents were dead, though he had never been certain. How they had promised him money and fame if he succeeded, and how they had threatened him with something worse than death if he failed. "His name was Uncle," Umar sobbed, using the only identifier he had for his handler. He said you were the reason children like me suffered, that if I didn't stop you more would die, but you're not like he said. You're not a bad man." Fatima Douamba had been standing near the back of the crowd when the incident unfolded. As one of Burkina Faso's leading experts on child trafficking and insurgent recruitment, she recognized immediately what she was witnessing. She had spent months tracking similar cases in the eastern regions of the country, but she had never seen the phenomenon strike so close to the heart of power. A tall, dignified woman in her 40s, Fatima had dedicated her career to understanding and dismantling the networks that preyed on vulnerable children. She had written extensively about how armed groups used orphans and displaced youth as expendable assets, training them for suicide missions, intelligence gathering, and targeted assassinations. But what she was seeing in Cumbri suggested something far more sophisticated than the usual rebel recruitment tactics. This wasn't desperation or opportunism. This was a calculated, professional operation with resources and planning capabilities that went far beyond what local insurgent groups typically possessed. As Traoré continued to comfort the sobbing child, Fatima approached carefully. She caught the president's attention and nodded toward Umar, a silent communication that conveyed both her professional credentials and her understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Mr. President," she said quietly, "this boy needs protection. But more importantly, he may be our first real window into something we've been trying to understand for months." Traoré looked up at her, still holding Umar against his chest. "What are you thinking, Dr. Dwamba?" "I'm thinking this wasn't a one-off recruitment. If they sent him, there are others. Possibly many others scattered across the region waiting for their own activation signals." The implications hit Traoré immediately. If Fatima was right, and her expertise suggested she probably was, then Burkina Faso wasn't just dealing with isolated incidents of child exploitation. They were confronting a systematic network that was using the country's most vulnerable population as weapons. Colonel Malik Sangaré, the president's security chief, had been listening intently. A veteran of multiple counterinsurgency operations, he understood the tactical implications better than anyone. "Sir," he said, "if this is part of a larger network, we need to assume there are other active cells, other targets, other children who might be activated before we can find them." Traoré stood slowly, still keeping one protective hand on Umar's shoulder. He looked out at the crowd of villagers who had been watching the entire scene unfold with mixture of confusion and concern. "They are using our children," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "Not because we are weak, but because they know our hearts are strong." He turned to Colonel Sangaré. "Lock down all roads leading out of the region. I want every vehicle searched, every passenger questioned. Find me that white van." Then, more quietly to Fatima, "I want to know how many more like him are out there. And I want to know who's behind this." Umar was taken into protective custody immediately, but not as a prisoner. Traoré was adamant about that distinction. The boy was to be treated as a witness and a victim, not a criminal. He was housed in a secure facility with counselors, medical staff, and child psychologists who specialized in working with traumatized youth. For the first 2 days, Umar said very little. The shock of his failed mission, combined with years of conditioning and abuse, had left him in a state of emotional shutdown. But gradually, with patient encouragement from trained professionals, he began to open up about his experiences. The details that emerged painted a chilling picture of systematic child exploitation. Umar described a compound outside the city of Dori, where dozens of children lived in military-style dormitories. They had no real names, only numbers assigned based on their order of arrival. They had no personal possessions except for the clothes they wore and the weapons they were trained to use. The daily routine at the compound was designed to break down normal childhood development and replace it with absolute obedience. Children were awakened before dawn for physical training that was more like military torture. They were fed just enough to maintain physical capability, but never enough to feel satisfied. They slept on thin mats in rooms with no privacy, no personal space, no opportunity for the kind of individual expression that allows healthy personality development. Most disturbing of all, they were subjected to sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to make them see violence as both normal and necessary. They were shown videos of atrocities and told that these were the result of weak leadership, of governments that refused to take decisive action. They were taught that by eliminating key targets, they would be saving their country from chaos and their fellow children from suffering. "They made us believe we were heroes," Umar explained to Dr. Sarah Caboret, the child psychologist assigned to his case. "They said that people like the president were the reason our families were dead, the reason we had no homes. They said if we were brave enough to stop them, we could prevent other children from becoming orphans like us." Dr. Caboret had seen the effects of child soldier programming before, but never anything quite this sophisticated. The psychological manipulation Umar described wasn't the crude brainwashing typically associated with rebel groups. This had the hallmarks of professional psychological warfare techniques, methods that required advanced training and significant resources. "Tell me about the instructors," she said gently. "Were they local people? Did they speak languages you recognized?" Umar frowned, struggling to remember details that his traumatized mind had tried to suppress. "Some were from here," he said slowly. But the main teacher, the one who taught us about targets and missions, he spoke French differently, like the people on TV from other countries. This detail sent immediate alarm bells through the intelligence community. If foreign nationals were involved in training child assassins on Burkinabe soil, the implications went far beyond domestic security concerns. Within 48 hours of Umar's confession, President Traoré authorized the launch of Operation WideNet, a comprehensive counterintelligence operation designed to map and dismantle the network that had nearly claimed his life. The operation had to be carefully structured to avoid alerting the very people they were trying to catch. Publicly, it was framed as a routine rural education initiative, part of the government's ongoing efforts to improve schooling in remote areas. Teams of supposed education assessors and child welfare workers would visit orphanages and youth facilities across the eastern and northern regions, conducting what appeared to be standard evaluations. In reality, these teams included covert intelligence operatives, child trafficking experts, and digital forensics specialists. They were equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment hidden in medical supplies and educational materials. Their mission was to identify facilities that claimed to be caring for at-risk youth, but were actually serving other purposes. Fatima Douamba took personal charge of the investigation's analytical component. Working from a secure facility in Ouagadougou, she coordinated with international partners to cross-reference satellite imagery, financial records, and communication intercepts. The satellite analysis proved particularly revealing. Using thermal imaging and pattern recognition software, they were able to identify 11 rural compounds that were registered under various NGOs, but showed activity patterns inconsistent with normal child care facilities. One location stood out immediately. The Maison de l'Enfant near Tapoa, ostensibly a home for war orphans, showed thermal signatures that suggested military-style training routines rather than the random movement patterns typical of children at play. "Look at this," Fatima said, pointing to a computer screen showing aerial footage of the compound. "See how the children move in formation? These aren't kids playing, these are organized drills." Colonel Sangaré studied the images carefully. As a military professional, he could recognize training patterns even from satellite footage. "They're practicing assault formations," he concluded. "Formation approaches, coordinated movements, tactical positioning. This isn't a children's home. It's a training camp." The decision was made to conduct a night raid on the Tapoa facility. But Traoré insisted on specific rules of engagement that reflected his commitment to protecting children, even those who had been turned into weapons. "Minimal force unless fired upon," he ordered. "No sirens, no intimidation tactics. These children are victims, not enemies. We approach them as rescuers, not conquerors." The assault team approached the Maison de l'Enfant at 0200 hours on a moonless night, using night vision equipment to navigate the rough terrain without betraying their presence. The facility was surrounded by a simple chain-link fence that looked innocuous enough but was equipped with motion sensors and infrared cameras, security measures, far beyond what any legitimate children's home would require. Captain Aminata Ouedraogo, leader of the tactical team, had insisted on including child psychologists and social workers in the raiding party. Her own experience with rescue operations had taught her that the first moments of contact with traumatized children could determine whether they would cooperate or remain silent out of fear. What they found inside the compound exceeded even their worst expectations. 21 children, ranging in age from 7 to 13, were sleeping on military cots arranged in precise rows. Each child had an assigned bunk marked with a number rather than a name. The dormitory walls were covered not with the colorful posters typical of children's facilities, but with maps, target photographs, and instructional diagrams showing human anatomy and vulnerable points for knife attacks. In a separate building, the team discovered what could only be described as a mission control center. Laminated cards were arranged on tables, each one containing a fabricated biography and a specific target assignment. The level of detail was staggering. Complete personal histories had been created for each child, including false names, invented family backgrounds, and manufactured emotional motivations for their assigned missions. One card, labeled Subject 17, contained a photograph of Umar alongside detailed information about his supposed orphan status, his psychological profile, and specific instructions for approaching and assassinating President Traoré. The card even included contingency plans for different scenarios: what to do if security was tight, how to blend in with crowds, what to say if questioned by authorities. But the most disturbing discovery was in a locked storage room that served as an armory. Along with the expected cache of knives and small weapons, the team found something that made even experienced soldiers uncomfortable: a trunk filled with children's clothing, each outfit carefully chosen to make its wearer appear as innocent and non-threatening as possible. "This isn't just child trafficking," Colonel Sangaré radioed back to headquarters. "This is weaponized childhood. They're not just training kids to kill, they're teaching them to use their innocence as camouflage." Most of the children found at the Tapoa facility remained silent for days after their rescue. Years of conditioning had taught them that speaking to authorities would result in severe punishment, not just for themselves, but for other children in the network. But on the third day of protective custody, a 10-year-old girl named Aisha finally began to talk. Her story revealed layers of psychological manipulation that went far beyond anything the investigators had previously understood. The children weren't just physically trained for violence, they were psychologically programmed using sophisticated behavioral modification techniques. Each child was given a tablet computer that appeared to contain simple educational games featuring animated animals. The children were told these games would help them learn to read and count, skills that would supposedly help them find families and build normal lives. In reality, the games were designed to deliver subliminal programming. Reward systems built into the software reinforced specific behaviors and thought patterns. Children who demonstrated the desired level of compliance and aggression were rewarded with better food, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, and praise from instructors who served as their only source of positive attention. The tablets also contained GPS tracking capabilities and encrypted communication systems. Mission commands could be delivered through what appeared to be innocent game updates, providing specific targets, timing, and methodology for attacks. Dr. Kabore was horrified as she reviewed the software found on the devices. "This represents years of development," she told the investigative team. The psychological understanding required to create this kind of programming doesn't exist in amateur circles. This was designed by professionals, people with advanced degrees in child psychology and behavioral modification. The revelation raised immediate questions about where such expertise might have originated. The investigation team began tracing the software's development, following digital breadcrumbs through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The trail led first to an educational technology startup in Nairobi, Kenya. On the surface, EduTech Solutions appeared to be a legitimate company developing learning software for African children. Their website showcased smiling children using tablets, testimonials from satisfied parents, and endorsements from education ministries across the continent. But when Fatima's team dug deeper, they discovered that EduTech Solutions was funded through a complex web of European grants and private investment that didn't quite add up. The company claimed to have developed their software using EU education development funds, but the actual financial structure was far more complicated. The money trail wound through banks in Malta, investment firms in Luxembourg, and ultimately connected to a French private equity company called Sahel Strategic Partners. On paper, Sahel Strategic Partners appeared to be focused on infrastructure development and educational initiatives across West Africa. In reality, as the investigation revealed, the company was a front for a much darker network of interests. Sahel Strategic Partners held controlling shares in a security consultancy that had been accused, but never formally, charged with conducting covert operations across the Sahel region during the previous year. "We're not dealing with local criminals," Fatima reported to President Traoré during a secure briefing. "This network has international funding, professional expertise, and political protection at levels we can barely comprehend." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The child assassination network wasn't an isolated criminal enterprise. It was part of a broader strategy to destabilize African governments that had become too independent. Too resistant to external influence, what they can't control through economic pressure, Traoré concluded grimly. They're trying to eliminate through targeted violence, and they're using our own children as weapons. The breakthrough in identifying the network's operational commander came from an unexpected source. One evening, as Umar was slowly recovering from his trauma through art therapy sessions, he asked to speak privately with President Traoré. 2 guards remained outside the secure room as the boy, his eyes carrying a weight far too heavy for his young shoulders, made a confession that would change everything. The man in the white van, Umar whispered, his voice barely audible. The one who told me what to do. I saw him on television. He was shaking hands with you. Traoré felt his blood turn cold, but he forced himself to remain calm. Can you describe him for me? He wore an expensive suit like politicians do, and he had a ring with a red stone that caught the light. He kept touching it when he talked, like it was important to him. The detail about the ring was specific enough to be verified. Fatima immediately began reviewing footage from all of Traoré's recent public appearances, looking for any individual who matched Umar's description. It took her 3 days of painstaking review, but she finally found him. In footage from a regional investment summit held 6 months earlier in Ouagadougou, she identified a man in his 50s who perfectly matched Umar's description. He was well-dressed, distinguished-looking, and indeed wore a prominent ring with what appeared to be a red gemstone. Most damning of all, he was captured on camera shaking hands with President Traoré himself, smiling broadly as they posed for photographers. His name was Louis Favre's mask finally slipped completely. They're resources, he said coldly. Expendable assets. You sentimentalize childhood because you don't understand power. These children were going to die anyway. From malnutrition, disease, violence. We gave their deaths meaning, purpose. We turned their suffering into strategic advantage. The recording device captured every chilling word. But Traoré wasn't finished. Give me the network, he demanded. The complete structure. Names, locations, funding sources. All of it, Favre laughed bitterly. If I do that, they'll eliminate me before I can leave this building. Do you think I'm the architect of this operation? I'm middle management at best. If you don't, Traoré replied with quiet intensity, I will ensure that every government in Africa, every international court, every media outlet in the world knows exactly who Louis Favre really is and what he's done to our children. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Favre's resolve cracked. What followed was a 3-hour confession that revealed the full scope of the network. Favre provided details about shadow companies in Malta, offshore accounts in Curaçao, recruitment facilities disguised as educational programs in Togo, Chad, and Niger. He described a system that had been operating for nearly 5 years, selecting the most vulnerable children across the Sahel region and turning them into instruments of political destabilization. The network's ultimate goal, according to Favre, was to create enough chaos and uncertainty to justify increased European intervention in African affairs. By eliminating leaders who were becoming too independent, too successful at building genuine sovereignty, the network hoped to maintain the kind of dependence that kept African resources flowing to European markets. You have to understand, Favre said, his voice taking on an almost pleading quality, Africa cannot be allowed to truly succeed on its own terms. Too much depends on maintaining certain relationships, certain economic flows. What we were doing, it wasn't personal. It was strategic necessity. The revelation that Louis Favre was connected to the child assassination network presented both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, they finally had identified a key figure in the conspiracy. On the other hand, Favre was a French national with diplomatic connections and legal protections that would make pursuing him extremely complicated. Intelligence. Reports confirmed that Favre was scheduled to appear at a high-profile summit in Dakar, Senegal, in just over a week. He would be representing European interests in a conference focused on youth development and regional stability, the same topics he had been publicly championing while privately weaponizing children. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Favre would be attending a conference dedicated to protecting African children while having personally overseen the transformation of vulnerable youth into instruments of political assassination President Traoré knew that any attempt to pursue Favre through conventional diplomatic channels would likely result in nothing more than bureaucratic delays and political complications. European governments had significant investments in maintaining the fiction that their development programs were purely humanitarian in nature. Exposing Favre would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how international aid could be weaponized for political purposes. Instead, Traoré decided to take a more direct approach. He contacted Senegalese President Bassirou Diomaye Faye through secure channels, requesting a private meeting to discuss a matter of mutual security concern. The response came within hours. President Faye would receive Traoré in Dakar, and cooperation was possible, but absolute discretion would be essential. Favre has protection, a Senegalese intelligence advisor warned during a preliminary briefing. Not just bodyguards, but legal immunity, diplomatic cover, and powerful friends in European capitals. If you move against him openly, they'll frame it as an attack on legitimate humanitarian work. Then we don't move against him openly, Traoré replied. We make him expose himself. The plan that emerged from coordination between Burkina Faso and Senegalese intelligence services was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to arrest or confront Favre directly, they would create circumstances that would force him to reveal his true nature and connections. The first phase involved feeding false information into channels known to be monitored by Favre's network. Intelligence operatives leaked a fabricated report claiming that the children rescued from the Topoa facility had provided detailed descriptions of their European handlers, including specific identifying characteristics and operational methods. The leak was designed to reach Favre through one of his known contacts in Nairobi, a journalist who had previously written favorable articles about the Sahel Children's Prosperity Initiative and who was suspected of serving as an information conduit for the network. Within 24 hours, the false intelligence had achieved its intended effect. Favre's behavior changed dramatically. The man who had previously moved through Dakar with confident ease suddenly became nervous, paranoid, constantly checking over his shoulder. He canceled a scheduled interview with a Senegalese television station, claiming a sudden scheduling conflict. He changed his hotel accommodation twice, moving to increasingly secure locations. Most tellingly, he began making encrypted phone calls from locations where he believed he couldn't be overheard. Senegalese intelligence, which had been monitoring Favre's communications since his arrival, intercepted several of these calls. In one particularly revealing conversation, Favre was heard telling an unknown contact, "The situation may be compromised. The children we deployed might have provided more information than anticipated. We may need to accelerate our extraction timeline." It was the closest thing to a confession they were likely to get through surveillance alone. But Traoré wanted more than intercepted phone calls. He wanted Favre to admit, on record, to his role in the network that had nearly claimed the president's life and had certainly destroyed the lives of dozens of innocent children. The meeting room was deliberately unremarkable. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a conference table that had seen countless mundane discussions about budget allocations and policy frameworks. Located in a nondescript government building in downtown Dakar, it was officially designated as hosting a routine consultation between regional education coordinators and European development partners. Louis Favre arrived at precisely 2:00 p.m., carrying the same leather briefcase he had used for hundreds of similar meetings across the Sahel region. His driver, who was actually a Senegalese intelligence officer, though Favre didn't know this, had delivered him through the normal security checkpoints without incident. To all appearances, this was just another in an endless series of bureaucratic meetings that formed the backbone of international development work. Favre expected to find the usual collection of mid-level officials, perhaps a few academics, maybe a representative from the African Development Bank. Instead, when he entered the conference room, only one person was waiting for him. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the far end of the table, wearing a simple dark suit rather than military uniform. His hands were folded calmly in front of him, and his expression was unreadable. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither man moved. Favre's first instinct was professional courtesy. After all, He had shaken hands with this man before, had posed for photographs, had exchanged pleasantries about their shared commitment to improving the lives of African children. But something in Traoré's eyes stopped him from extending his usual diplomatic greeting. "Mr. President," Favre said carefully, remaining standing near the doorway. "I wasn't expecting... That is, I was told this was a routine coordination meeting. Sit down, Mr. Favre." Traoré's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Favre hesitated, his diplomatic instincts finally registering the true nature of his situation. He glanced toward the door but found his way blocked by two men in plain clothes who had materialized silently behind him. Not threateningly, they simply stood there, making it clear that leaving wasn't currently an option. "This is highly irregular," Favre said, but he moved to the chair across from Traoré. "I have diplomatic status. There are protocols for these kinds of meetings, proper channels." "You can't do this," he continued as he sat down, his voice beginning to betray the first hints of genuine fear. "I represent the Sahel Children's Prosperity Initiative. My government will be expecting a full report of my activities here. If I disappear, if something happens to me..." Traoré leaned forward slightly, his calm demeanor more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. "Tell me about Umar," he said simply. The name hit Favre like a physical blow. For a split second, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing something raw and panicked underneath. But he recovered quickly, falling back on years of training in diplomatic deflection. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anyone by that name." "A 12-year-old boy," Traoré continued, as if Favre hadn't spoken. "Orphaned, malnourished, desperate. You picked him up from the streets, promised him food and shelter, trained him to use a knife, told him exactly where to find me and how to get close enough to kill me." Favre's hands, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble slightly. He clasped them together to hide the tremor, but the gesture only made his nervousness more obvious. "You're making serious accusations without any evidence," he said, attempting to regain his diplomatic composure. "I work with children, yes, but to help them. To provide education, health care, opportunities for a better future. If someone has told you otherwise, they're either mistaken or deliberately lying." Traoré reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small recording device, placing it on the table between them. The message was clear. Every word of this conversation was being preserved. "You made weapons out of children," Traoré said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You don't get to hide behind humanitarian rhetoric anymore." The accusation hung in the air between them. Favre stared at the recording device, his mind racing through options and possibilities. How much did they actually know? How much could they prove? And most importantly, how much danger was he actually in? "You don't understand the complexities of development work in this region," he said finally, switching tactics from outright denial to philosophical justification. "Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Sometimes stability requires actions that appear harsh to those who don't see the bigger picture." "Difficult decisions," Traoré repeated, his tone flat and cold. "Is that what you call turning orphaned children into assassins?" Favre's facade began crumbling more rapidly now. The stress of the situation, combined with years of carrying the psychological weight of what he had been doing, finally began to overwhelm his diplomatic training. "You think you understand power?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think you're building something here, creating some kind of African renaissance? But you're just creating noise, disruption, unpredictability. And unpredictability has to be managed." Traoré remained silent, letting Favre continue talking. It was an old interrogation technique. Give subjects enough rope to hang themselves with their own words. "Populations need guidance," Favre continued, seeming to gain momentum as he spoke. "Especially in regions like this, where historical patterns, cultural limitations, educational deficits, these factors create environments where traditional governance structures simply can't function effectively. Without external support and oversight." The words revealed more than Favre probably intended about his worldview, about the fundamental assumptions that had made his actions seem justified in his own mind. "And children are just variables in your equations?" Traoré asked quietly. The question seemed to break whatever internal dam had been holding back Favre's true thoughts. His carefully constructed humanitarian facade finally collapsed. Completely. The recordings of Favre's confession were encrypted and immediately transmitted to 4 trusted international journalists and 3 African legal coalitions. Within hours, the story began breaking across multiple media platforms simultaneously, making it impossible for any single government or organization to suppress or control the narrative. The revelations sent shockwaves through the international development community. EU child protection agencies found themselves under intense scrutiny, forced to audit their partnerships and review their oversight procedures. The French government launched an emergency parliamentary inquiry, though critics noted that the investigation seemed more focused on damage control than genuine accountability. Back in Burkina Faso, President Traoré addressed the nation in a televised speech that was broadcast across the continent. Standing before the national flag with Umar's crayon drawing pinned to the wall beside it, he spoke with quiet dignity about what had been uncovered. "We have exposed a network that stole our children," he said, "not with chains but with false promises. They turned the most innocent among us into weapons, not because they were strong, but because they knew our hearts would break at the sight of a child in need." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "This ends now, not just in Burkina Faso, but across our continent. We will no longer allow our children to be seen as expendable resources by those who profit from our suffering." The speech resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Social media campaigns began organizing across Africa, with the hashtag #NotOurChildren trending in multiple languages. Other African leaders began publicly calling for investigations into similar networks operating in their own countries. But Traoré understood that exposing the network was only the beginning. The conditions that had made children like Umar vulnerable in the first place, poverty, displacement, lack of educational opportunities, absence of social support systems, would continue to exist unless actively addressed. Within a week of Favre's arrest, Traoré signed a comprehensive decree establishing the Children's Vigilance Authority, a new government agency with unprecedented powers to investigate and prevent child exploitation. Uniquely, the agency's advisory board included former victims like Umar, giving survivors a direct voice in shaping protective policies. The decree also banned all unverified NGOs from working with orphaned or displaced children, requiring extensive background checks and continuous oversight for any organization seeking to operate child welfare programs in the country. Perhaps most importantly, the traditional orphanage system was completely restructured. Large institutional facilities were replaced with legacy homes, small, family-style housing units, where no more than 8 children lived together under the care of trained guardians who were themselves members of the local community. "Children need families, not institutions," Traoré explained to Parliament. "They need to belong somewhere, to someone, to know that their lives have value beyond what they can do for others." The legacy homes were designed to preserve cultural connections and community ties rather than isolating vulnerable children in institutional settings where they could be more easily exploited. Each home was embedded within existing neighborhoods, with children attending local schools and participating in community activities just like any other family. The most controversial aspect of Traoré's response was his insistence on treating the rescued children as victims rather than criminals, even those who had successfully carried out violent acts before being captured. Several of the children found at the Tapoa facility had been involved in previous attacks. Some had killed, others had delivered explosive devices or conducted surveillance that led to civilian deaths. Traditional justice systems would have treated them as criminals, regardless of their age or the circumstances of their recruitment. Traoré rejected this approach entirely. They were never given a choice, he argued before a sometimes skeptical parliament. "We will give them one now." The National Rehabilitation Program for Exploited Children became a model that would eventually be studied and adapted across Africa. Rather than punishment, the program focused on healing, education, and gradual reintegration into normal community life. Adama, a 13-year-old who had been forced to stab a village chief, was enrolled in carpentry training. Under the guidance of master craftsmen who understood his history, he learned to create beautiful furniture that brought joy to families rather than violence. The same hands that had once held a knife now shaped wood into cribs for babies and desks for students. Salif, trained to plant listening devices and gather intelligence on government officials, became fascinated by technology when introduced to it in a positive context. He eventually developed digital literacy workshops for rural teenagers, teaching them skills that could help them build legitimate careers in the modern economy. The program wasn't without its critics. Families of victims struggled to understand how children who had harmed their loved ones could be treated with compassion rather than punishment. Some military officers argued that showing mercy to child soldiers would encourage further recruitment by making the consequences seem less severe, but the results spoke for themselves. Recidivism rates among children who completed the rehabilitation program were virtually zero. More importantly, many became powerful advocates against child exploitation, sharing their stories in schools and communities to prevent other children from falling victim to similar networks. The revelations about the child assassination network reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. At the United Nations, Traoré introduced a motion for a global child protection protocol that would establish international standards for monitoring organizations that work with vulnerable children. The protocol called for mandatory background checks on all international development workers, real-time monitoring of NGO activities through surprise inspections, and the creation of a transnational database to track children who might be at risk of exploitation. Initially, the proposal faced significant resistance from European governments and established NGOs who argued that such oversight would interfere with legitimate humanitarian work. But the evidence from Favre's network was too overwhelming to ignore. The turning point came when Umar addressed the UN General Assembly via secure video link. Wearing a simple white shirt and speaking in a clear, steady voice, he shared his story with the world's most powerful leaders. "They told me I would be remembered if I stayed invisible," he said, looking directly into the camera. "But my president saw me when I needed to be seen. He showed me that being visible, being known, being valued, is what makes us human." The speech was broadcast live across multiple continents. In the assembly hall, seasoned diplomats who had heard countless speeches found themselves wiping away tears. The boy's simple words had cut through layers of political rhetoric to expose a fundamental truth about human dignity and child protection. Within 6 months, the Global Child Protection Protocol had been ratified by 43 nations. The European Union, initially reluctant to support measures that would increase oversight of their development programs, eventually endorsed the protocol after intense pressure from African governments and international civil society. The fight against child exploitation networks came with significant personal costs for those involved. President Traoré found himself targeted by sophisticated disinformation, campaigns designed to undermine his credibility and distract from the larger issues raised by the investigation. European media outlets began running stories questioning his democratic legitimacy, his human rights record, and his competence as a leader. The same organizations that had previously ignored or downplayed child exploitation in Africa suddenly became very interested in critiquing African governance when it threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about international development work. Fatima Douamba faced even more direct pressure. As the lead investigator whose work had exposed the network, she received death threats, attempts at professional sabotage, and sustained harassment designed to force her to abandon her research. But perhaps the most significant cost was paid by the children themselves. Even those who had been successfully rehabilitated carried psychological scars that would last for years. Many struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the complex trauma that comes from having been systematically betrayed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Dr. Kabore, who continued to work with many of the rescued children, noted that their healing process was complicated by a fundamental crisis of trust. "These children learned very early that adults lie," she explained. "That people who claim to care about them might actually be using them. Rebuilding their ability to trust, to form healthy relationships, to believe in their own worth. That's the work of many years." 2 years after the events in Cumbri village, President Traoré returned to the site where Umar had once approached him with a knife hidden beneath his shirt. The irrigation system he had promised was now operational, bringing reliable water to farms that had struggled with drought for decades. But more importantly, the village had become home to one of the first legacy homes, where 8 formerly exploited children were growing up as part of the community rather than as isolated victims. Umar, now 14 and noticeably taller, had chosen to remain in Cumbri rather than returning to his home region. The village had become his family, and the people who had witnessed his transformation had become his guardians in the truest sense. He still struggled with nightmares sometimes, still carried scars from his experiences that would never fully heal. But he had also discovered talents and interests that had been suppressed during his time in the network. He showed remarkable artistic ability, creating drawings and paintings that helped other traumatized children express their own experiences. He had also become fascinated by agriculture, working alongside village farmers to learn sustainable farming techniques. "I want to grow food," he told President Traoré during one of the leader's regular visits to the legacy home. "I spent so long learning to destroy things. Now I want to help things grow." The conversation took place in the same spot where, 2 years earlier, Umar had collapsed in tears while holding a knife. Now the same hands that had once been trained to kill were gentle as they tended to young plants in the village garden. Despite the success in dismantling Favre's network, Traoré and his team knew that the fight against child exploitation was far from over. Intelligence reports suggested that similar networks continued to operate across the Sahel, adapting their methods to avoid the kind of detection that had exposed the original conspiracy. New threats emerged regularly. Drug trafficking organizations began recruiting children as couriers, using the same psychological manipulation techniques that had been perfected by the assassination network. Human trafficking rings started targeting children from the legacy homes, seeing their rehabilitation programs as sources of already traumatized youth who might be easier to control. But the infrastructure created to combat the original network proved adaptable to these new challenges. The Children's Vigilance Authority expanded its mandate to address all forms of child exploitation, not just political recruitment. The rehabilitation programs developed for former child soldiers proved effective for victims of trafficking, abuse, and other forms of exploitation. Most importantly, the cultural shift that had been sparked by Umar's story continued to spread across the continent. Communities that had once seen vulnerable children as inevitable casualties of poverty and conflict began viewing them as national treasures to be protected at all costs. Traditional leaders who had previously turned a blind eye to child exploitation began actively monitoring their communities for signs of recruitment. Parents who had once felt powerless to protect their children from forces beyond their control began organizing local protection. Networks teachers started incorporating child protection education into their regular curricula, teaching students to recognize and report suspicious adult behavior. Even children themselves became more vigilant, having learned that they had the right to refuse orders from adults who asked them to do dangerous or harmful things. In his private office in the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré kept Umar's crayon drawing pinned to the wall beside the national flag. Visitors often asked about it. The simple sketch seemed out of place among the formal portraits and official documents that typically decorated such spaces. The drawing showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one small and one tall. There were no weapons, no signs of violence, just 2 people connected by trust and care. Umar had given it to Traoré during one of their early meetings, when the boy was still struggling to believe that adults could be trustworthy. "This is what I want the world to look like," Umar had explained shyly. Big people and little people helping each other, not hurting each other. For Traoré, the drawing represented everything he was fighting for. A future where children could be children, where vulnerability was met with protection rather than exploitation, where the relationship between the powerful and the powerless was defined by care rather than manipulation. The drawing also served as a daily reminder of how close they had come to losing something irreplaceable. If events in Cumbri had unfolded differently, if Traoré had followed standard security protocols instead of trusting his instincts, If Umar had been less conflicted about his mission, the story might have ended with tragedy rather than transformation. But instead, it had become something unprecedented in modern African politics, a story of genuine redemption, of a leader who had chosen to see enemies as victims, who had responded to violence with compassion, who had turned a moment of potential catastrophe into an opportunity for systemic change. The networks that had sought to destabilize Burkina Faso through violence had instead strengthened the country's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable citizens. The children who were meant to be weapons had become advocates. The crisis that was designed to create chaos had instead created unprecedented unity around the fundamental principle that children deserve protection, not exploitation. In the months following the exposure of the network, delegations from across Africa came to study Burkina Faso's child protection model. The legacy homes, the rehabilitation programs, the community-based monitoring systems, all of these innovations were adapted and implemented in other countries facing similar challenges. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one: the understanding that how a society treats its most vulnerable children is the truest measure of its values and its future. As President Traoré often said in his speeches about the program, "We are not measured by how hard we can strike our enemies, but by how carefully we can heal the wounds they leave behind." The children they tried to turn into weapons have instead become our greatest teachers about forgiveness, resilience, and hope. The story that had begun with a trembling boy holding a knife had evolved into a continental movement for child protection, and at its heart remained a simple truth that Umar had expressed in crayon and color. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is one person choosing to see another person's humanity, even in the darkest of circumstances. This story continues to unfold across Africa, where leaders inspired by Traoré's example are implementing similar programs to protect vulnerable children and break cycles of exploitation. The fight is far from over, but the foundation has been laid for a future where childhood is protected rather than weaponized, where trust can be rebuilt even after the deepest betrayals, and where the smallest voices can spark the greatest changes. And he was listed in the summit's official documentation as a regional advisor to the Sahel Children's Prosperity Initiative, a French-backed development program that had recently announced its withdrawal from Burkina Faso, citing regional instability. The irony was bitter beyond words. Favre had been publicly praised by Traoré for his organization's commitment to improving the lives of vulnerable children across the Sahel. The president had even defended Favre's program at international forums, arguing that organizations like his represented the kind of international cooperation that could genuinely benefit African nations. Now it appeared that behind the humanitarian rhetoric and carefully staged photo opportunities, Favre had been systematically recruiting and training orphaned children to serve as assassins.